Welcome everyone to our forum this morning. Thank you to the Gwangju Democracy Forum, the May 18 Foundation, friends and allies of democracy around the world for your presence here today. It is a distinct honor for me and my fellow panelists to be the opening session of the week, and we hope that we are starting discussions that will not only continue for a long time, but will also end with real change in a more peaceful democratic world. My name is Marcy Tanter. I am an international education advisor at the May 18 Foundation, and I believe that sharing the story of the Gwangju uprising is important and necessary as a means to get at the truth of what happened, to someday soothe the grief of Gwangju citizens, and to show the world how peaceful protests can spark systematic changes in an oppressive society. Sharing the story around the world is the focus of our panel today. The last verse of the poem, O Gwangju, the Cross of Our Nation, by Kim Jun-tae reads, Gwangju, Mudong Mountain, oh, our eternal flag, our dream, our cross, the city of youth that will get younger as time goes by. Now we are firmly united, surely and surely, we hold each other's hands tight and rise up. The poem is a lamentation for what the city of Gwangju has lost during the uprising. In this final verse, Kim Jun-tae fears that the younger generations might not remember the sacrifices of their ancestors, but for now the survivors stand together and rise up to keep the memories alive, to keep fighting for democracy, and significantly, to tell the story of the uprising and what those lost lives mean and why they matter. Our panel today continues Kim's cry that we must not forget what happened, and we must remember the lessons that come out of the sacrifice of the Gwangju citizens. The spirit of May 18 lives on and has spread to other places where citizens fight for democracy like Hong Kong and Myanmar. The participants today represent different views of the uprising and how we can spread its history around the world 41 years later. From eyewitness accounts to years of investigative research, their unique perspectives stress why we must continue what Kim Jun-tae was afraid to lose. The struggle for democracy in Gwangju was part of a decades of struggle by Korean citizens to throw off oppressive governments and stands as an example of what can be accomplished when people come together and refuse to back down. The loss of life in Gwangju was tragic. The murdered citizens will never know how much their bravery was responsible for forcing the wedge between Chun's dictatorship and the will of the people, but we know. It is up to us to tell the story and to use it to inspire confidence in human rights activists and protesters around the world as they fight their own battles against injustice and oppression. The story can also inspire those who want to stand up but don't know how. We begin this morning with short comments from each panelist, followed by discussion. If any audience members have questions, please put them in the chat. The Q&A will follow the group discussion, and then Mr. Yun-hee, a participant in the uprising, will give a concluding statement. Our panelists this morning and their topics are Mr. Paul Courtright. His topic is the role of memoir in telling the story of Gwangju. Mr. Bill Amos, the advantage of telling the story of 5/18 and similar events through fiction. Mr. David Dollinger, the importance of staying connected to the human rights movement post 5/18. Professor Donald Baker, the academic aspect of getting the story of the uprising and similar events out to the world. And Mr. Tim Shorrock, the role of the press in reporting events as they happen and keeping stories like the uprising alive decades later. So Paul, will you start us off, please?
Great, thank you very much. And so as was just mentioned, I've been asked to talk today about my memoir, Witnessing Gwangju, which describes the rather small part of the story of the whole Gwangju uprising. But in particular, I'm talking about my memoir as its potential importance to a global audience. And so the first question you may want to ask, well, why write a memoir? Well, I had always wanted to write what I had witnessed all those years ago, but really I wanted to do it just for myself to begin with. And the fact is, I did not feel I was the person to publish a memoir. I'm not a specialist like Dawn here and others in the area of Korean political history. And finally, as a foreigner, it was not my story to tell, certainly not to Koreans. But I did write a memoir. And so I have to ask the question, well, what changed that led me to write this memoir? First, the full telling of the events 41 years ago really did not see the light of day until 1988. And before then, there was one single false narrative that was created by Chan Du-hwan. And that it's only now, in fact, only in the last few years, has the real full story really emerged clearly. Second reason I decided was, well, the person I thought who could best write it as a foreigner was Tim Warnberg, but unfortunately Tim passed away in '93. And the third reason that I decided to sit down and write the memoir was I recognized that even after years, Americans had very little understanding or appreciation of the uprising. And I felt that people might be more likely to read a memoir about it than they might then write or read about it in a scientific article. But in May 2019, when Witnessing Gwangju was about half finished, I came back to Korea. And when I came back to Korea, I frankly was shocked to learn that Chan's narrative was still believed by some Koreans. And because of that, some of my Korean colleagues said that Koreans needed to hear the story from a foreign perspective, a person without a particular bias. That really surprised me. I figured that the story of the whole Gwangju uprising was well understood and well appreciated. I was really very wrong. So writing Witnessing Gwangju reminded me why it is important to get the full range of stories from that whole event and have it become part of our whole global collective memory. First, the fact is that there is no single story that can tell everything. This uprising covered a large area, a huge number of people. It happened over many days. My story, in fact, every story is really just a small part of a much bigger picture. The second thing I realized is that few stories that I had seen about the uprising, few stories really capture what was going on in the surrounding small towns around Gwangju. There's almost a perception that the uprising was only an urban event. But in fact, there was widespread rural anger at Chan Du-hwan and widespread rural support for the uprising. And the third thing that came out of writing my memoir is that I felt that stories should inspire. And it's because I was inspired. I was inspired by the defiance that I witnessed against an overwhelming force encircling the city. I was also inspired by the degree of cooperation that it was exhibited by everybody. Of course, there were some disagreements, but there was an overwhelming sense at that time that we're in this together. So what I hope is that my memoir helps people in many places, can be places like Myanmar, Hong Kong, Egypt, even the US, to consider a few things. First, learn how to prevent false narratives from becoming widespread. Second, learn how to capture stories from people whose stories rarely get told. And third, learn how to foster cooperation so that everyone sees that that defiance can actually lead to success, even if that success cannot be achieved immediately. Thank you very much, Marcy. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. That was very moving, very, very moving. So Bill, switching gears a little bit, going from reality to fiction, tell us your thoughts.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is William Amos. I was a United States Peace Corps volunteer from 1979 through 1980. I lived in Mokpo on the southwestern coast of South Korea until December of 1979. My work site at the time of the Gwangju uprising was Anyang, which is very close to Seoul. I was not present myself in Gwangju during the uprising, but I did get caught up in the large demonstration in Seoul that took place a few days beforehand. I'm the author of a novel called The Seed of Joy. The title comes from a Korean saying, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, "Kotong은 nage shiashida," or "trouble is the seed of joy." The novel spans the period from the assassination of Park Chung-hee through the December 12th coup to the end of the uprising. It's the story of a young American Peace Corps volunteer who bears witness to these events. He and the main female character, a Korean woman, and 2 other Peace Corps volunteers witness all the tragic events of the Gwangju uprising from its beginning on May 18th to the return of the government troops at the end of the uprising. They participate in many of them. This novel is part of a growing body of fiction that tells the story of the Gwangju democratic movement. It includes works by Han Kang and Hwang Sok-young, and movie and TV productions such as Sandglass, May 18, A Pedal, and A Taxi Driver. My novel is unique in that it is written by a non-Korean in English for a mostly foreign or American audience. The Seed of Joy is a work of historical fiction, and being based on historical events, I tried to make it as accurate as I could. I was at a disadvantage writing it. Most of the writing was done in the 1990s when the uprising was still largely shrouded in secrecy. Starting out, I had only 1 bootleg video cassette of a Korean documentary about it. My first date with my wife, who is Korean, was her coming to my apartment to translate it for me. We didn't get very far. Amid repeated "omo," "kesakidu," and other phrases that I can't repeat at this setting, she was overcome with shock at each new revelation. I eventually found more sources and finished writing the book, but I had to fill in the gaps in the story with what I hoped were reasonable assumptions. Much of it was based on my personal experiences in Korea. Generally, the boring parts are about me, the exciting parts are not. The theme of the novel became clear to me as I delved into writing it. The story of Korea at the time was all about Han, that deeply rooted, elusive sense of sorrow and resentment and an unsatisfied thirst for justice. This was the scaffolding on which I hung the elements of this novel. That part was surprisingly easy. The uprising was emotionally wrenching in its own right. I didn't have to embellish it for dramatic effect. I created characters, both Korean and American, and let them observe these events, participate in them, and become changed by them. So why write a novel about the Gwangju uprising at all? Aren't the bare facts enough? Don't the plethora of books and academic papers on the subject provide all the information anybody would need? I don't think so, not entirely. A bare recitation of facts can tell the story up to a point. A novel written with honesty and empathy can add the element of emotional depth. A nonfiction book about the Gwangju uprising will help you understand what happened. A work of fiction can help you understand how it felt. However, excuse me, turning a historical event into a work of fiction poses a risk. There's always the possibility that an author will bend the history to fit the story instead of the other way around. This can give the audience, which may have little knowledge of the events, a completely wrong impression of what really happened. Hollywood does it all the time. But the Gwangju uprising happened only 41 years ago, within living memory. Witnesses are still alive. So when I wrote The Seed of Joy, I felt duty-bound to stick as closely as possible to the facts. I didn't want to misrepresent the Gwangju democratic movement to a foreign audience. I wanted my fellow Peace Corps volunteers and Koreans who were there to be able to say, yes, that's what it was like back then. Perhaps surprisingly, the Seed of Joy ends on a positive note. In the last chapter, 18 years after Gwangju, South Korea has already held several long-awaited free elections. Kim Dae-jung has been elected president, and after years of trouble, joy has finally taken root. In conclusion, I'd like to note that my friends on this panel had a great influence on my novel. David's and Paul's exploits in Gwangju were known to me and inspired parts of the story. Tim Shorrock's articles about the United States' response to the uprising were a treasure trove of information. And Don Baker, whom I met by chance at a Peace Corps event in Korea in 2010, was the expert academic source I needed to iron out some historical nuances. He provided generous encouragement as I released my second edition of the book in 2015. So I tip my hat in gratitude to these four gentlemen here. So thank you very much.
Great, that was really good. Thank you, Bill. David, let's hear from you.
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there. So I have a little bit of a hard aspect, I guess. And when Marcy gave me this topic, I sort of ended up calling it a life force, the importance of staying connected. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background about myself. So I first arrived in South Korea in April of '78. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was in what was referred to as the K-45, so the 45th group of Peace Corps volunteers to ever go to Korea. And I was actually a tuberculosis control worker, working in a very rural health center that was about an hour and a half southwest of Gwangju. So it was in Jeollanam-do province in the small county of Yun-hee. And it was very rural. We did not even have a paved road that went through town. That's the reality of Korea back then, that we sort of have lost now that, you know, we go there today. But, you know, what was interesting about it is I sat in my health center. I had one part of me that could go out and look at Ultrasan Mountains, beautiful mountains. Another side that I could go out and see the Yongsan River. So to me, I was in a perfect place for me. And really, my life there was really nice. I enjoyed it. You know, I would occasionally go to Gwangju, but I was not someone that was that pushed to go to Gwangju. But what happened was I was invited to a wedding that was to occur on May 17th. So I actually went to Gwangju on May 16th. And was actually able to be there for the candlelight visual march to the provincial capital and got to see that. And I talked to friends of mine that were college students that said, no, this is it. We've been asked to go back to the campuses and to study. We're willing to stop protesting. We're willing to do that because we've been told that this will allow democracy to come about. What's interesting though, is I came back on the way back to Yunnan on Sunday, the 18th into Gwangju. It was about 4 p.m. And as I was pulling into the bus station, you could smell the tear gas in the air. I mean, you just knew it. Unfortunately, those of us that were back in Korea at that point in time pretty much knew the smell of tear gas. And we also had a curfew that was put in place, so I couldn't even make it back to my health center for the next, that same day. So I was actually lucky enough that evening to run into Tim, and Tim had witnessed the beginnings of all the demonstrations that occurred on May 18th and walked me around downtown, showed me exactly where things were going on. One of the things though that really struck me as we were standing near the provincial office buildings, he and I talking, and he was pointing out where some of the students had been grabbing stones from a construction site to use against the soldiers. An old halabuji, so an old grandfather, came hustling over to us. He didn't blink an eye, immediately started speaking to us in Korean, asking as if we knew what had happened. And Tim immediately said, of course, no, I saw it. And I'm like, no, I haven't seen it, grandfather, but Tim has been telling me all about it. And he just looked at us and said, we can't stand up to this. The citizens of Gwangju cannot stand for this. We have to fight back. This was on Sunday. On Wednesday, the 21st, the Buddha's birthday, I walked back into Gwangju. One of my first tastes of walking back into Gwangju was running into the KCIA. My second sort of taste of walking into Gwangju that day was seeing troops fire guns out of helicopters at protesters down on Kumnam, witnessing what was going on in the hospital emergency rooms, looking at what was happening in the morgues, how there were so many bodies, the morgues were completely filled. And then having to be there and listen to the cries of parents when they found their loved ones. You cannot put into words how that tears into you. Then on top of that, one of the things that I actually did is I helped, along with people like Tim, as well as Paul, translate for foreign journalists. I also was the only foreigner that actually had free access to the provincial capitol buildings. And so in some ways, probably not the smartest thing I ever did. And I'm sure Paul will probably agree with me. I spent the night on Saturday into Sunday in the provincial office building, where I actually helped a student and a retired master sergeant from the Korean military monitor the military radio, because they had asked me that to please help them monitor the radio because they thought maybe the troops might use English to communicate with one another when they were actually going to come back and try to retake the city. So I was there until the end. We were brought out the day after everything. The Peace Corps came down and got us. And just to put a little bit of icing on the cake, discussion here, we actually did tell the Peace Corps we would not leave Gwangju. We were told that we should leave. Tim, myself, and one other Peace Corps volunteer actually all said that we would not leave because we felt that we had to actually bear witness. And so when I look back on Gwangju and what occurred there, I tell people I was born in Gwangju. That's where I sort of finally understood who I needed to be as a human being. And it was based upon what I witnessed, what I saw people willing to sacrifice, and some of the things that I actually did. So, it didn't end there though, because I couldn't let it end. I had promised people in the provincial office building to get the word out. So a year later, I actually came back to the States and went to graduate school. Unfortunately, I'm not someone like Don or others. I'm actually a PhD in microbiology. I'm a science kind of person. And that's why I haven't finished my memoirs yet of what occurred in Gwangju. But based upon everyone that I met there and what I witnessed, it has stayed with me. It forced me when I got back to the States to stay involved in human rights and getting the word out on what occurred in May of 1980. It is something that lives with me day in, day out. I now spend my life developing tests for human diseases. And you can say, well, how does that really connect with what you saw in May of 1980 and what you experienced? The thing is, the tests that I develop have a positive impact on people's lives. And that's what I've dedicated my life to. And every place I've ever worked, everything I've been involved in, every day, I see what happened in Gwangju. I see the people I met in Yun-hee working in the health center. That has lived with me and has driven me, because I can tell you that my life has not been easy, because I just spent the last year working on COVID diagnostics, tried to put things in place in 8 different low and middle income countries around the world to try to help them deal with this crisis. I do this still for TB. I do it for Hansen's disease. You name the neglected disease, and that's what I'm working on. And it's all to have impact. And it really is, I would say, the experience from Gwangju that has driven me every day, because I can invoke a vision of those people. And when I feel down and like I don't want to keep it going, I bring them up. If I need to help motivate my people that I'm working with, I tell them about those experiences, what people were willing to give up. And, don't take it, for all of its worth, but we live a very privileged life. And only 41 years ago, there were people in Korea that did not, that had to think day in, day out about themselves, their family, the people around them. And in most cases, they always put other people first. So that's really the lesson that I've taken from Gwangju. And I've tried to invoke in everything that I've done, in the people that work with me, anyone that's really willing to listen. And I can tell you, not to pat myself on the back, but it has made a difference because of what I experienced and what I saw people willing to do. I'm willing to break paradigms. I'm willing to go against the system and change things for the better. And that's what we need to really take out of a lot of this, is that you have to be willing to stand up. Because if you're not saying anything, it's the same thing as feeding into the violence that may be occurring, whether it's in Hong Kong or Myanmar, or even here in the United States when it's against people of Black color, right? Silence is violence. So no matter what, we have to be willing to keep the torches alive, to always stand up and try to make a difference. And the one thing, if you look at the people that I knew that didn't make it out of the provincial office building, they knew it. They knew it on Sunday when I talked to them, and they were willing to die for the better of the majority. It wasn't about themselves. And those are the lessons we need to take from these kinds of experiences and from the history of what happened in May of 1980. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, David. That was very beautiful. Thank you. I hate to switch gears from something so heartfelt and deep to the cold hands of academia. But Professor Baker, give us your insight onto the academic aspects, because of course they are important. So let's hear from you.
Okay, I'm a professor of Korean history, but I also was in Gwangju in 1980. So I try to be objective when I teach about it. I teach about it all the time, of course. I have to teach about it in my Korean history classes. I tell my students it's the most important event in modern Korean history since the Korean War. I also give public lectures. I've been doing that since the mid-1980s as someone who is an expert, supposed to be an expert on modern Korea. I've often been asked to speak to community groups about what happened. And also I teach a survey of all of Asia in one course. And I always use May 18th as an example of how difficult it can be to achieve a democracy. When I teach in my Korean history classes, I have to explain to the students why Gwangju. I try to explain that Gwangju is down there in the Southwest, and the Southwest has long had a reputation for resisting oppression. In the 19th century, there was the end of the 19th century, there was the Shorrock rebellion, which started a little north of Gwangju. In the 1920s, there was the famous Gwangju student movement against Japanese colonial rule. And of course, there was 1980. I also mentioned that Gwangju had suffered during the Park Chung-hee years, 18 years of Park's dictatorship. They suffered economically when Park favored the Southeast. And there was not just economic discrimination, but you could see actual discrimination in general against people from the Gwangju area. Wasn't that way in the early 70s. It was that way by the end of the Park Chung, early 60s. It was that way by the end of the Park Chung-hee era. And I, of course, also explained that Kim Dae-jung in 1980 was Korea's hope for democracy, and he was a son of the Southwest. And he was arrested on the 17th of May, and he would have won a free election that year if one had been held. So that's why Gwangju, that's why on May 18th, when Chun Doo-hwan declared nationwide martial law, the only place where even a few hundred students went out to protest was Gwangju. The rest of the country was quiet. And of course, those few hundred students who showed up at the front gates of Cheonnam University, they were attacked they expected to be hit with tear gas. It wasn't tear gas, as we know, it was clubs that maim and kill. And when some of them escaped and ran downtown and the troops chased them and the people in Gwangju saw that, they came to defend them, having to defend their own children against the troops of their own government. And it's hard to explain it. A lot of my students have trouble understanding how that happened. So I try to give them the background and try to tell them my own experiences in Gwangju. So it can seem real to them. In my larger class, when I talk about all of Asia, I mentioned already, I use Gwangju as an example of how difficult it can be to get democracy, but then I also use Gwangju, May 18th, to give them hope. I tell them that, first of all, my course to try to talk about the modernization of Asia in general, political, economic, cultural, and social, and the political modernization is democracy. And that's Gwangju is my prime example of that, how it led to democracy in Korea. But I show them that it did lead to democracy. That in 1980, like many people in Gwangju at the time, I'd given up hope. So I left Korea soon after that. I was still working on my doctoral dissertation in Korean history, but I couldn't work in Korea anymore. I had to get out of there. But look now, South Korea is one of the most democratic countries on the face of the earth. So it shows it can happen. You know, if you're willing, as Dave told us, to give your life for democracy, you may not get democracy yourself, but democracy will come. It took a while. It took a while. I stayed away from Korea while Chun Doo-hwan was president, by the way. I didn't want to go back while he was still president. And so I tell people that Gwangju should be an inspiration. What happened in May 18, 1980 should be an inspiration to people in China, Tiananmen, 89, they still don't have democracy. In Myanmar today, what we learned from that is that if people are willing to risk their lives, which they did, and some of them lost their lives, to fight for democracy, it is an inspiration to people. I mean, we saw, like I said, I gave up hope in 1980, but 1987, I did go back to Korea. It was Chun Doo-hwan's last months. I went back and saw the streets of Seoul filled with people demanding democracy. And they got it. A decade later, Kim Dae-jung was elected president. The purpose of the attack on Gwangju in 1980 was to get rid of Kim Dae-jung. And so it does happen. You know, if you fight for it hard enough, eventually have hope, don't give up. I want to tell one little story of one of my classes. I gave my usual lecture on what happened on May 18th, and a Korean-Canadian kid approached me after the class. He said, "Are you sure about that? My parents were there. They never told me about that." So I said, "Go home and tell your parents what I told you and see if they say I'm telling the truth." He came back the next class, after class, and privately approached me and said, "I talked to my parents, and they said what you said was true, and that's why they immigrated to Canada." They didn't tell him because it was such a horrible memory. They didn't feel they needed to burden him with that. So now most of the people I talk to about May 18th are not Koreans, or not even Korean Canadians. Most of my students are not, even in my Korean history classes now, they're not mostly Koreans, which is interesting. So why do I tell them about May 18th? Well, first, I want them to understand that those of us who live in democratic countries sometimes forget that it was a struggle to get democracy. And so talking about May 18th is to remind people to be grateful to their ancestors, if they live in democracy now, to be grateful to the ancestors who did fight for democracy, but also to take May 18th as a sign of hope, because out of the ashes of May 18th, all the bodies on the ground, all the bodies that I saw in the gymnasium across from the provincial Capitol building, all those bodies provided a fertilizer that fertilized the tree of democracy that's blooming in South Korea today. I'm convinced that South Korea would have eventually become democratic, but I think what happened, what the people in Gwangju did in May 1980 accelerated that process. It once the people in the rest of Korea found out about it, it took a while because of censorship, that totally delegitimized the military dictatorship. And so the people in Gwangju, I think at the time they probably felt like most of us did, this is over, it's hopeless, nothing we can do. But we now know that they actually inspired the great democratization movement that eventually brought democracy to South Korea. And so to me, that's the spirit of May 18th. I try to share with my students and when I give public speeches on this topic as well. The spirit is the people of Gwangju taught us, don't give up. Continue to fight for what is right. And eventually that fight will be won. That is the message of May 18th.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Tim, you're going to take us in a whole other direction, but please let's hear your thoughts.
Well, maybe not. I just want to start by saying, you know, I obviously I wasn't there in 1980, but I was there not too much longer after. I first visited Gwangju in 1981 in February, so just 7 or 8 months later. But really, my introduction to Korea came as a kid when I was living in Seoul, as my parents were basically relief workers in post-war Japan and then post-Korean War Korea. So I lived there from 1959 to 1961, and my father was running this very large church-based relief organization called Church World Service, which it turns out was actually one of the largest, contractors for the U.S. Embassy in distributing U.S. aid at the time. And his offices were right downtown where the April 19th, revolution took place. And I was 9 years old and very interested in what was going on in the world, read the newspapers every day. And my dad was coming home. My dad was actually trapped down there in 419. And it was for me, it was a really exciting time. Martial law and seeing tanks on the streets and schools were closed and so on. But I kept all these clippings of what happened. And it's sort of my first work in journalism, really at 9 years old. But I was really amazed by we'd always been taught about revolution, and here people were actually standing up against a dictatorship and pushing it out and winning their democracy. It was a real eye-opening experience for me as a kid. And I always remembered April 19th, and I always remembered, wow, these Koreans, they stood up. They stood up to this fascist dictator they had there. Everyone knew who was living in Korea at the time what kind of government Syngman Rhee was running. And so that made a huge impression on me. And later on, in my high school years, my parents moved back to Tokyo, and I was living in Japan, and I saw these massive, anti-war demonstrations against war. And of course, I got very caught up in the anti-war movement myself, resisting the draft and trying to educate people about what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam. And after coming back to the U.S. and sort of in this period of tumult in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, after I left college, I actually got had my first work experience. People tried to organize a union. I saw my union get crushed, and it's kind of was getting educated really fast in the realities of American politics, and I was really involved in the anti-war movement. But around in 1975, when the war ended in Vietnam, there was suddenly this war scare was ginned up by the U.S. government and the Park Chung-hee government. And it was like, oh, Kim Il-sung is going to invade any time and try to take over South Korea. Well, what are we going to do? I started thinking, like, wait a minute, what's going on in Korea now? If there's still this kind of threat of war, and what's going on? And so I started arguing within the anti-war movement. Okay, Vietnam may be over now, but we got to start looking at Korea because it's still divided. There's still, tensions between the two sides. The U.S. still has massive military force there. So I decided, I had to go figure out, at that time I went to graduate school to kind of understand what was happening in Korea and Japan when I was growing up. And I happened to be, because I was interested in I had this experience having a union being crushed, I started really paying attention to what was going on in South Korea at the time. And so I was, actually writing a thesis at the University of Oregon on the labor movement in South Korea. And it's sort of, how workers had really built this so-called industrial miracle. And as I was studying this, I was reading the newspapers every day and, really trying to keep track of what was happening as much as I could. And of course, as you all know, the situation blew up in large part because of, industrial workers not taking it anymore and students joining industrial workers. And this whole idea of this economic miracle that the US was, praising as this fantastic alternative to communism in the third world was, basically coming apart in its face. And so I was watching, all that fall 1979, there was these worker kind of uprising by workers, and what happened. They took over the opposition party, and the building was raided by police, and the opposition party leader was thrown out of the Congress and the National Assembly, and then there was the uprising in Busan and Masa. And then, the period of martial law that was declared when Pak was killed. And so because I'd had these missionary connections from my parents, I was getting reports, April and May about what was going on in Korea, from the Korean churches through the US churches and Japanese churches. So yeah, actually the first few days of Gwangju, I remember being on the phone with the Quakers who were in Tokyo at the time, and and getting other reports through the church networks that had been set up. And so we got some of the first reports of the terrible violence that had happened in Gwangju, but it really took, so I was like horrified by what I was watching, and then also what I was watching on TV, where Americans, Richard Holbrooke and other diplomats were just saying, and Jimmy Carter himself was saying, we cannot stand for a, communist uprising in a country that, so the democracy, our desire for democracy, can only go so far. We're not going to put up with this kind of uprising and justifying, their aid to the Korean military. And I thought this was terribly wrong. And I wanted to know why this had happened. And so when I did go there in '81, I was lucky enough to meet some of the missionaries that were, his name escapes me right now, but he was a chaplain at one of the hospitals. He died recently. And that was when I first got the first real eyewitness reports about what had happened. And then I went there again in '85 after the situation, after some people had been released from prison. That's when I got, almost, as much as I could from people who had actually been there. And it was then that I really started trying to figure out what had led to this US policy. And you know, that, you know, in 1989, whenever it was that they had these hearings, the National Assembly, and the US put together this so-called white paper about what the US had done in Gwangju and before and after that period. What I did was I did a FOIA request for every memo, every letter, every meeting, every possible bit of information I could get. And to my surprise, after 3 or 4 years, I managed to get about, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 documents, and it took me a long time to read through them. But you know what I read, you all know what I found, and it was astonishing to me. But you know, getting back to the press coverage, I followed it really close, and I'm so happy to be here with people who help these reporters get the word out, because you know, I made a list today of the ones that I really learned from. Norman Thorpe, we talked about before, with the Asia Wall Street Journal. He was there, he spoke Korean. You know, Terry Anderson of the AP, who was later, you know, kidnapped in the Middle East. You know, Brad Martin, who wrote some really good stories for the Baltimore Sun. Henry Scott Stokes of the New York Times. And of course, Jürgen Hitzpeter, who got the first video and you know, camera shots out, which I know I saw on NBC News, you know, and that those are some of the reports that really moved me. And of course, there's a lot of Japanese reporters there too. A lot of them are unnamed, but you know, there was people that, you know, that really wanted to convey what had happened. But unfortunately, you know, most reporters, this is then as even now, most U.S. reporters in Korea were based in Tokyo. They weren't based in Korea. And so they covered Korea like it was like a sideshow kind of, you know, and like you see in the movie, a taxi driver, Jürgen Hitzpeter, you know, he's in Tokyo and he hears about it. He goes, well, not very many American reporters, you know, did that, except the ones that were there, like Norman Thorpe. And you know, and with few exceptions, these reporters just bought what the U.S. Embassy would tell them. And they, you know, they bought the official story from the U.S. So they were very concerned about the human rights violations, but you know, security was at stake, and you know, this was not a problem of Koreans of the United States. You know, it was Koreans killing Koreans, and we had nothing to do with it. Well, we had to support security, and you know, we all know what the line was. And so many reporters bought that line. Including, in my mind, to his shame, Nicholas Kristof, who was the bureau chief of the New York Times in '96, when I happened to be in Tokyo as a bureau chief for another paper. And you know, that's when my stories broke about the sort of hidden US role, about basically, you know, the ambassador meeting with Chun Doo-hwan on May 8th, May 9th, 1980, and basically saying, you know, yeah, we will understand it if you have to deploy military troops, you know, against these demonstrations. Which were, as everyone knows, were about to be called off because they believed what they were being told by politicians, that, you know, if you stop demonstrating, then the military would back off. And of course, you know, that didn't happen. But, you know, Kristof was there in '96 when my stories broke. And I got this from people in the Bureau and also from people in the LA Times Bureau who were told the same thing. They called the US Embassy to ask about, you know, their interpretation of these cables, and they were told there's nothing new here, you know, move on. There's no story here. The New York Times never ever ran anything about, you know, the role of the top administration officials from Jimmy Carter on down in sort of giving a green light to them to use the military. They didn't order the massacre at Gwangju, but when the uprising happened, they put it, you know, May 22nd, 1980 was one of the most important documents I got when they met at the White House to figure out their strategy. And this was May 22nd, you know, 24 hours earlier had been the massacre in front of the provincial building, when about at least 58 people were shot to death that day, according to, you know, my people in Gwangju, EJE and others who really know what happened that day. And the US, you know, when they met at that meeting in the White House, they knew, this is what I discovered fairly recently with another Korean reporter, they knew that there had been these people mowed down in front of the building by the special forces, And they still decided they had to put this uprising down by force. And, you know, we heard later from, you know, Korean military people when they testified that the US asked the Korean forces to hold off for a few days so they could get all their military assets in place around the Korean peninsula, such as the aircraft carrier and the surveillance planes from Okinawa. So, you know, the US military role was very, you know, apparent, but it's still hit, you know, it's still like you can still talk to all kinds of policymakers here and they'll say, well, you know, it was a bad mistake, but, you know, we really had no choice. And, you know, the country was about to, some people will even say North Korea was about to invade. But getting back to this, you know, the narrative that was talked about earlier, you know, I too was stunned when I went there in 2015, I think it was one of my first trips back, you know, this century, and I was accosted. I was asked by people, you know, what about these 600 North Korean troops that were, you know, officers that were supposed to be there? And I'm like, well, I was astonished that people believe this because, you know, I had all these U.S. intelligence reports, and U.S. intelligence was, and the US government was desperately trying to show that there was a connection with North Korea in these events. And there's not one single mention of anything, except there is one report that I still see quoted where there was a North Korean agent or somebody they said was a North Korean agent was nabbed at the Seoul railroad station. And when I remember back to that Nightline that happened on ABC during the uprising, they had this US general up there and he cited that report, which I got years later under FOIA, saying, well, there was a North Korean caught in Seoul Station. You know, he obviously, you know, North Korea was involved. But they, you know, these I mean, the thing is, the documents show that the US treats Korea, well, first of all, it's a subordinate power, but it's, you know, you all develop human relations with Korean people, you know, solidarity with Korean people from your work and everyday life. You know, what we see in the embassy and we see in the government is it's a military relationship. It's a subordinate military relationship. It's not a human to human. And so, you know, the lie gets spread easily that way because Korea is just is not seen as like it's not really seen as a sovereign country by so many people in it, what I call the military-industrial complex here. And so much of their viewpoint is shared by the mainstream press. And I'm afraid that if Gwangju happened today, of course, you know, with the internet and Twitter and everything, it's, you know, you can't really, you know, do that kind of mass killing without being known to the world. But if there was an uprising today, I'm afraid that a lot of the reporting would reflect the US national security viewpoint. I mean, so many reporters just, they transmit that ideology through the reporting and the way they talk about North and South Korea.
Tim, I need to.
So anyway,
stop.
that's where I want to end. Like, we still have a lot of work to do, but the story is still important to be told because it's a clear example of how a people can stand up to the misuse of power and dictatorship, and how you know, people can respond and support it on a human level.
Yeah, thank you, and you make excellent points there. We're almost out of time, but Yun-hee is he's going to make a statement. It is going to be in Korean, but we'll have it translated with English subtitles for when the video is posted online later. Yun-hee.
Hi, how are you? My name is Yun-hee. 만나서 반갑습니다. 팀, 파울, and Marcy. 5.18 광주 항쟁의 진실을 위해서 여러분들께 진심으로 감사를 드립니다. 저는 그때 1980년 5월 21일부터 5월 26일 새벽까지 전남 도청에서 시민군으로 활동했다가 군 부대에 붙잡혀서 곧바로 군대에 입대했습니다. 지금까지 저는 38년 동안 일체 비밀에 붙여 있다가 38년 만에 제 사진 이렇게 나와 있어요. 피터 헌터, 독일 피터 헌터 기자가 제 영상을 공개해 가지고 38년 만에 제가 그동안에 입을 다물고 있다가 이제서 여러분들 앞에 공개를 하게 됐습니다. 지금도 그 도청 안에 있을 때의 그 상황을 생각하면은 지금도 항상 눈물이 나옵니다. 총도 여기 옆구리에 여기도 총도 맞았고요. 예, 제가 이번에 조그만 책자를 잉글리시 책자를 만들었습니다. 그래서 나중에 이제 팀이나 파월이나 또 아시아 모두 한 번씩 드리도록 하겠습니다. 하루빨리 코로나가 끝나야만이 내년에는 광주에서 만나 뵙기를 바랍니다. 오늘 모두 만나서 반갑습니다. 감사합니다. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We maybe have time for one question. Let's see. Okay, so we have one question. This is for Paul. As an observer residing outside Korea, how do you perceive and understand the reasons as to why this false narrative of the ex-military junta leader has been revived even before he published his controversial memoir and gained popularity in Korea in recent years? And how much do you believe, if at all, this false narrative being translated into English directed to the foreign audience?
I'm presuming the question is reference to Chun Doo-hwan's false narrative about what actually happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so, I think when you have a situation as existed in Korea in 1980, without any free press and without the structures of democracy, you essentially have somebody, in this case, Chun Doo-hwan, who can create and sustain a narrative that's completely false, and there is nobody there to challenge it. And so that can easily, not just be created, but it can persist. And I'm afraid what happens is that when people hear that narrative, no matter, how many falsehoods are in that narrative, people, they start to take it as fact. And they take it as fact simply because they hear it over and over and over again. And so when we look at that false narrative that is still, believed by some people in Korea today, my guess is primarily the elderly population, frankly, people my age and over, who basically had no other source of information at the time except the government, except Chun Doo-hwan. And they took that as the reality. And it's very hard. I mean, frankly, look at America today with QAnon and what Trump has done. It's very hard to shape people's beliefs if they've heard it over and over again, and they have not really dived in and looked at the evidence and looked at the facts. And that's why I think that whether it's my memoir or Don's writing or the work that Tim has done and Dave, it is a full body of work that Koreans have, particularly obviously in Gwangju, have taken to really document what actually happened. That is so critical. But let's be honest, it takes a long time, and some people, I'm afraid, probably will never change their attitudes because it has taken just too long to settle in.
Okay, well, on that note, we actually have reached the end of our time. Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. Hearing from each of you was a really just beautiful experience, and I appreciate your time And I appreciate what all of you do to keep this narrative going and to keep, not just to keep the spirit of May 18 alive, but also to inspire activists who are out there today who need a little bit of reinforcement, you know, because I'm sure that it can be a very lonely road sometimes. And I think your words today were very encouraging, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. All of you take care. I hope everyone can be vaccinated soon. And, you know, Jewish people say next year in Jerusalem, and my phrase is hopefully next year in Gwangju, when we can all be together again, and it would be a very wonderful thing. So thank you all. Have a great evening, rest of the day, wherever you may be. Thank you to the audience members who were here. Yun-hee, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you have to run to another meeting. May 18 is a busy time for everybody. So thank you. I'll take care. Bye.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Marcy.
Bye.
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 See you next year. Thank you.